Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, we are finally going to take our first deep dive look at GOAT format, summer 2005. I have been reluctant to profile GOAT format on my channel, really for a couple of different reasons. One, there's already a wealth of information out there about GOAT format. There are entire websites devoted to it. You can already play in tournaments. It's arguably the most popular Time Wizard format right now, that and I guess possibly Edison. And as a result, a lot of players who play retro are already well inundated with GOAT format. However, this channel has often been used for some as an introduction into older Yu-Gi-Oh!, so I still think there's value in profiling GOAT format. The other reason I've been reluctant to profile GOAT format is because of its popularity. Modern day GOAT format isn't necessarily representative of what it was like 17 years ago. The decks that were played at the 2005 US Nationals are not really all that playable today, which creates a bit of an issue, right? My channel is called Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thus far, I've profiled old decks with just minor tweaks here or there, mostly for card choices that I think I would have made 5, 10, 15 years ago. GOAT format's a little bit different because if I profiled actual 2005 decks, they aren't necessarily representative of what you would see in a tournament today. And if I profile modern day GOAT format decks, there's obviously that distinction in the opposite direction. As a result, in the offshoot here, right in the beginning, I'm going to make it very clear that today I'm profiling the GOAT format deck that I currently have built in my deck box that I brought to play on the side at the Connecticut Regional this past weekend, which means it is a modernized version of a deck. It is based on the current meta that a player would anticipate playing against if they were to go in and play in a GOAT format event today in 2022. What that ultimately means, big picture, is that this particular format, and there will likely be other formats where this is warranted, certainly as I get deeper into something like Edison, I should probably make this distinction as well. This is going to be an example of an old format with that modernized twist. Very few formats have undergone the shift that GOAT format has, and as a result, I'm going to distinguish between actual historical decks that are card for card, or very close to card for card, what you would have seen if you actually teleported back 17 years ago, or what you would anticipate seeing if you went and played GOAT format, for example, this weekend at your local card shop in a Time Wizard format. And I really hope in the comment section below you can let me know what you think about that, because obviously this channel has been exclusively devoted to the history. I think GOAT format, and I guess as time goes on, Edison, as I mentioned before, deserve that asterisk where perhaps I should be profiling a little bit of both. Some exclusively modernized, some exclusively historical, and then perhaps in the comment section below you can let me know what you think about it. Without any further ado, to talk about what I'm actually going to profile today, I'm going to be profiling the deck, as I said, I currently have built, which is a Chaos GOAT control base deck with Decree. So GOAT format's undergone some interesting shifts. Actual Metamorphosis, Scapegoat, Thousand Eyes Restrict strategies kind of fell out of favor for a little while. They've had a bit of a renaissance, a bit of a resurgence recently, and that's why I've elected to play a full 3 copies of Metamorphosis, Scapegoats, and even Book of Moon. I really like that particular package against some of the Warrior decks. I find that it can slow the game down. The Warrior strategy, really tries to prey on things like flip effects and Thousand Eyes Restrict and Scapegoats, kind of clog the field, slow the game down, allow you to grind them out. I've also elected to play Royal Decree because I think that actually lines up really well against what I consider kind of the boogeyman in the room, which is Chaos Warrior decks with a lot of traps. Decks that are playing cards like Judgment, Trap Dust Shoot, even Sakuratsu Armor, in addition to the other really powerful traps of the time, Torrential, Mirror Force, Ring, etc. So I really like the Decree package. I think it gives you a little bit of leverage against those pretty difficult Warrior-based strategies. It also lets you then play Book of Moon, and I really like Book of Moon because I think Book of Moon hedges really well as a defensive card. Right, if you're putting someone's Kaiku, you can just proactively activate it, flip it face down, and then summon your Chaos monsters, obviously. You can also set it, though, and use it defensively to protect, let's say, your Magician of Faith from an attack from a Blade Knight. That's obviously a fine interaction. And it serves a better role than a card like, I think, Mirror Force or Sakuratsu Armor, because if your opponent has Kaiku, they don't have to attack. They can just sit there and lock you out, which is where Book of Moon would come in handy. Obviously, Blade Knight running into Sakuratsu Armor or Mirror Force is really beneficial to you because it just gets it off the field. But if you're also hedging against your opponent keeping Kaiku face up, having Book of Moon is valuable there because if you can just deal with the set Blade Knight, using Book of Moon is more or less the same thing. I know it's a -1, but protecting that Magician of Faith, especially if you have a power spell, is a high priority. And therefore, a card like Book of Moon, I think, does a really good job both against the face of Kaiku, but also the attacks from Mystic Swordsman or Blade Knight. And then in addition to that, it helps reset Thousand Eyes Restrict, something that Sakuratsu Armor and Mirror Force simply doesn't. So because of the interactions there with Book of Moon, I've elected just to simply play 3 Royal Decrees. If I have a defensive card, I'd rather it be Book of Moon. I ended up bumping that up to 3. And then I think by doing so, it made me realize that I might as well just take out some of these traps and just play that Decree package. It hedges really well against the Warrior deck. It also does a pretty good job against some of the Chaos decks that play Regeki Break. Not as much Wing Blast, primarily Regeki Break. There are even some of the Chaos decks that play Solemn Judgment. So to me, I really like where Royal Decree is positioned right now. It's also fantastic against Panda Burn, which is why I've elected to play Chaos, which is going to be Chaos Sorcerer, Black Luster Soldier, the Goat package, which I still think is pretty good right now, and then Decree as opposed to that traditional trap lineup. But this is what I currently have built. This is what I would play at a tournament if I were to play one this weekend. The format is ever-changing, although it's at this point almost 20 years old. But before we get into the deck profile again, I'm going to reiterate again, really do, in the comments below, let me know what you think. Do you prefer exclusively historical deck profiles with very little reference to how those formats have shifted over the course of the last 10, 15, 20 years, depending on the format? Or do you prefer this blend, some retro, and then some of this modernized? But without further ado, let's finally get into that deck profile, taking a deep dive look at my Chaos, Goat Control, Royal Decree, Goat format deck. All right, we'll start with the monsters. We have 3 copies of Thunder Dragon. Now, as you'll see, this deck doesn't have as many ways of abusing Thunder Dragon as other variants. You'll see that the trap lineup does not contain cards like Raigeki Break or Wing Blast. I'm not main decking Tribe Infecting Virus, so this deck doesn't necessarily synergize as well with Thunder Dragon as some other Chaos decks, but I still think the ability to fill the graveyard up with 3 light monsters if you need it, obviously combined with Graceful Charity. Obviously, it counteracts a little bit of the reality that you're going to be playing against cards like Dawn Zalug, maybe even Spirit Reaper, of course, Delinquent Duo. I think it still warrants a spot. It also, level 5 matters a lot. When you play Decree, as my deck does, cards like Reaper on the Nightmare tend to be really good Metamorphosis targets, so having a level 5 in your deck is really valuable. Then I have elected to play the full 3 copies of Magician of Faith. It's just the most powerful flip effect. It's also a level 1, it's a light. I don't have to go into all the various reasons why Magician of Faith is so good. If you can protect it with cards like Book of Moon, which is a chainable card, you can sometimes protect it from things like Mystic Swordsman and Blade Knight. And the reality is just getting off 1 Magician of Faith can be game-breaking, particularly if it's on a power card. So 3 copies of Magician of Faith, 2 copies of Dekoichi the Battle Chanted Locomotive. It's a very common card to see in some of these variants. The ability to draw a couple cards, it's a 1400 beater. You do need to eventually win the game, and just having monsters that can attack is really important. And Dekoichi is that perfect middle ground between it has enough attack that it matters. Your opponent can't just continually sit there and take 14 like they would be able to from Magician of Faith, but also in the same vein, it generates a little bit of card advantage. So Dekoichi, fantastic. We have, of course, the Chaos package. We have only 2 copies of Chaos Sorcerer. I think you could definitely bump it up to 3. I have elected to run 2 just so that I can include some other cards. And then, of course, Black Luster Soldier. Shout out to Dallas, who hooked me up this past weekend and swapped an English Collector's Rare for a French Collector's Rare. For those of you who know me, you know I love foreign cards, so having a foreign French Black Luster Soldier is pretty sweet. So that was a really exciting swap this past weekend. One thing that makes this deck probably a little bit different than your traditional Chaos deck is I have a very small, literally 2 card, but very small Old Vindictive Apprentice Magician package to go along with the 3 Magician of Faiths. One of the reasons why I've elected to include both of these is that they line up fairly well against warrior-based decks, right? If your opponent, I guess Mystic Swordsman sort of excluded, but if your opponent attacks you with a card like Blade Knight, for example, the Apprentice will still resolve. Obviously, Old Vindictive won't, but Blade Knight, but Apprentice Magician will resolve, and then that can obviously search Magician of Faith that you can summon on the next turn. If your opponent's attacking you, thinking that it's going to be Smai with Grandmaster Suzuki, the Apprentice Magician is pretty great. Old Vindictive Magician kind of works a little bit like Night Assailant does, but because this deck's not running a ton of those discard outlets, I don't necessarily think that a card like Night Assailant's necessary. It also gives me some flexibility in the side deck where I can add more copies of this. I've always liked the Apprentice engine. I really liked it with Creature Swap, which you'll actually see in my side deck as well. So I think it's just an interesting divot in the Chaos variants right now. So just a couple, just 1 of each. I'm not going overboard with multiple apprentices, but I like the flexibility there of allowing you to search either the Magician of Faith or the Old Vindictive Magician. And of course, it's also a Dark Monster. It also combines really well with Breaker. You can actually add a counter back to Breaker with Apprentice Magician. That's a really cool interaction. One of the cool interactions back in the day was to Apprentice Magician and actually give a counter back to your opponent's Breaker and then play Creature Swap, get their Breaker, pop their back row, and then crash into the Breaker with the Apprentice Magician. Well, attack over the Apprentice Magician on their field with the Breaker. They don't have to crash, but you'll be able to attack over it and then special summon out a Magician of Faith. Now, I'm not main decking Swap, but I am side decking it, so that is an interaction worth noting. There's, of course, Sangan and Sinister Serpent, and then 1 copy of Tsukiyomi. You could theoretically bounce Tsukiyomi up. I think if you're protective of your Tsukiyomi, you really only need 1. Granted, if you lose access to it, that can be pretty bad because I am playing a triple Metamorphosis build. and I think it's just a fantastic card against warriors, but I don't want to draw 2. And with a card like Royal Decree, you can, generally speaking, protect your Tsukiyomi if you're vigilant enough. So I feel like if you just make sure to protect that one single copy, you only really need the one. You don't have to worry about it getting destroyed by Mirror Force, a Torrential, or running it into Ring of Destruction if you have cards like Royal Decree in your deck. So it's a little bit risky to play one in a deck that plays the triple Metamorphosis, but I think it's warranted if you're willing to make the accommodations of not running it into back rows that are unnecessary. So that's the monster lineup. Then for the spells, what's interesting is GOAT format, although called GOAT format, hasn't necessarily always had Scapegoat Metamorphosis-based decks as playable, but I definitely think there's points in time where this package is totally reasonable. And if people are going to be playing Warrior decks, I actually rather like Scapegoats against those style of decks, so we're going to play the full 3 copies of Scapegoats, and then 3 copies of Metamorphosis. You could obviously go to 2, that's probably more typical, but I really like Metamorphosis. I think it's kind of fluctuated in popularity over the years. When everybody was first playing GOAT format, they were playing it, then it sort of cycled out of popularity, and then as Warrior decks became more popular, then it came back, and I actually think Scapegoat's pretty good against some of the combo decks too, right? They can, generally speaking, OTK through Mirror Force, Torrential, those type of cards, because they have multiple True Names, but it's hard to OTK through Scapegoats. You definitely can, but it's hard to do that. Because I've elected to play Decree in order to have some protection that also functions really well with this package, I've elected to go fully 3 copies of Book of Moon, right? If you're not going to be playing the traditional traps and you do want some level of protection, I think Book of Moon is also more flexible, right? If your opponent's sitting there with Kaiku, they don't necessarily have to attack into Mirror Force, Sakuratsu Armor if you sided it in. With Book of Moon, you can just proactively activate it and then summon a Chaos Monster, which I think is really good. It's also, I think, a little bit better into an established board, right? There's obviously situations where playing Book of Moon can be great into a board, as opposed to a Sakuratsu Armor where you're playing a little bit more reactive instead of proactive. So I think with this deck, especially because I'm just playing Decree and playing Metamorphosis, I think Book of Moon serves a better function there. So I'm fully maxing out on 3. 2 copies of Upstart Goblin. This isn't necessarily for the math, right? I'm always looked at Upstart Goblin as a pretty overrated card. I know there was a period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where 3 was basically staple, and I definitely played decks that had 3, but I think the math is a little bit overrated, particularly if there are other cards that you'd want to play. But because I'm playing triple Magician of Faith, I actually think that this is warranted, not for the math, but just to have a spell. So that's why there's 2 copies of Upstart Goblin. I have 2 copies of Nobleman. This is actually a little bit debatable. I think you could actually feasibly consider putting in a card like Mind Control instead, but I've elected just to keep it safe with Nobleman. You might say, why Mind Control? You have 3 books. There's obviously good interaction there. There's good interaction with Tsukiyomi, so even against decks that don't necessarily set a lot, there's still some interactions that are valuable. That's true. Under most of those conditions, the Mind Control is relatively similar. Mind Control also can out a Chaos Monster. It's obviously better against a card like Magician of Faith, right? If you have Nobleman and your opponent does have Magician of Faith set, you would rather it be Mind Control. Granted, your opponent could also be setting Sangin, so there's a debate back and forth there. Maybe 1-1 is an interesting split. That way you're hedging a little bit in case you draw multiples, and that way you can use the one that's better in the situation. But I've elected just to keep it traditional and have the 2 copies of Nobleman, but I definitely think there is a discussion there for the possibility of Mind Control. And then we have sort of just the expected, the 1 Snatch Steal, Heavy Storm, Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, and of course, Delinquent Duo. James Arp told me a funny story about Italian Delinquent Duo, so if he goes and watches this, he can see that I told him I had an Italian Delinquent Duo, so there's my Italian Delinquent Duo. Notice there's no MST. I guess that's a card worth noting because I'm playing Decree. I just don't necessarily think it's all that important to play MST, right? If you have Decree, you don't really care about your opponent's back rows unless they play something like Snatch Steal, and you can usually avoid running into a situation where that really matters. Now, granted, that's not always possible, but you know, sometimes the situations where they Snatch Steal and just keep it forever, you would want to have MST, but I don't think it's necessary. So I've elected to cut it. There's no premature, but that's a pretty common cut at this point years ago. So I think it's really consolidated down just to the most important spells. And then as I alluded to, I'm running a Decree trap lineup. So sometimes people elect to play a couple non-Decree traps. I've elected to do 1. I think Ring of Destruction, just because it's a win condition, is worth including, right? You can draw into Heavy Storm and do a play where you make a big push and then ring your opponent for game. So I think Ring of Destruction serves a purpose even with Decree face up on the field because you can draw into your heavy. So there's still that 1 copy of Ring of Destruction, and then I've gone a full 3 copies of Royal Decree. Again, I think Decree has its moments. If people are going to be playing Panda Burn and cards like Sekuratsu Armor rise in popularity in Warrior decks, I think Decree becomes more and more warranted. So I've elected to cut cards like Regeki Break and Wing Blast for the Decree package. And it then opened up more cards like Book of Moon and Scapegoats in the main deck. So this is my current drop lineup. Next, we'll talk about the extra deck. Now, this is just a traditional GOAT format extra deck. It's just sort of the pile that I have been carrying around. So we have, we'll start, I guess, with 1,000 Eyes. We have, of course, 1,000 Eyes Restrict. We're going to do this really quickly because there's not a 15-card limit. So in theory, you go back to the actual time period, you could have an unlimited extra deck. Unlimited fusion deck is what it was called at the time. So theoretically, this is really just a 3 of every single card that's legal. But here are the ones that you more commonly go into in GOAT format if you're not familiar. You, of course, 1,000 Eyes to combine with Metamorphosis, with Scapegoats, Sinister Serpent, and Magician of Faith. You have Dragoness, which is the best level 3 to go into. Sometimes you need Flame Ghost because it's a dark. Dark Flare Dragon is a level 4. It's also a dark. So those are the ones. There technically are the ones, but they're weaker defense or attack points. And honestly, you just pretend you have 3 each. My deck box is only so big, so I only have 1 each. But in theory, there would be 3 each of these. Galitha, I think it's called, is a light level 5. You might sometimes need it to be a light, so that's why it's in here. Rio Senshi, you can actually feasibly go into with Chaos Sorcerer, so you definitely want some of those. And again, I have 2 here, but put 3. Again, I'm just putting 2s for a lot of these upcoming cards, just for the space in my deck box. We have a couple of Reaper on the Nightmares, which I actually mentioned are pretty important because they combine really well with Thunder King. One of the things with Decree is that sometimes if you clog your field with Scapegoats, at least what your opponent thinks is clogging the field, you can end up tributing for a Thunder Dragon and then go into Reaper, and then all of a sudden it kind of puts them in an awkward situation where this is attacking directly, hitting their hand, and they have Decree up, plus what they thought was a game where you kind of locked yourself out, and all of a sudden they have to deal with that. A couple copies of Dark Bolter, also another level 5. We have some more level 5s with Fiend Skull Dragon 6s. We have Dark Blade, a couple of those. Ojama King, you definitely want more. I only have 1 ultimate Ojama King, but you definitely want multiple Ojama Kings. We have Dark Flare Knights. We have King Dragoon. Very unlikely to go into it, but it's not impossible. Same thing with the Last Warrior, but it's not impossible. And again, there's no limit, so you might as well use it. This is more feasible in decks that have Dark Magician of Chaos, but you never know. Maybe you can snatch steal it. So we have Gatlin Dragons. We have Master of Oz, which is very unlikely that you would ever go into. You basically only go into this if you snatch steal their Master of Oz in a Cyberstein deck and then Metamorphosis it, but hey, it could happen. And then, Twin Thunder Dragon. So just a giant package of what you would anticipate going into. Obviously, a lot of these you'd often never go into, but unlimited extra decks. And if you were going to actually play in a tournament, you might as well have as many options as possible. In Dueling Book, you basically have the ability to go into anything. So that's not a super important part of the deck profile. In terms of the side deck right now, so this is my current side deck. Here are my GOAT tokens, my original Scapegoat tokens. But in terms of the actual side deck, what do you expect to play against in this format? There's some combo decks. There's like Stein-ish decks, some that have Monarchs in it that was popular not too long ago. There's like actual FTKs, Empty Jar. There's Royal Magical Library. I don't have a Royal Magical Library here, so we can represent that with the Feather of the Phoenix. We have Cyber Jar, obviously Empty Jar decks. There's a variety of just random FTK combo decks. There's Reasoning Gate decks. So I'm going to put a Sacred Crane, even though they don't necessarily always play that, but there are reasoning-based decks. There's a Bazoo deck that I actually really advocated for when people first started to play GOAT format with the Fusion and Machines, but you still sometimes see Bazoo, maybe with or without that package. Obviously, you have Panda Burn, which is pretty good. You've got a bunch of Warrior variants. There's a lot of different cards you can play in Warrior decks, so I have 3 of them here with Suzuki, Blade Knight, and then Don Zalug. There's obviously Chaos variants with Decree, without Decree, with Turbo, without Turbo, with Goats, without Goats. So I'm going to just use Chaos Sorcerer to kind of represent a large array of different cards. And then obviously there's the Mirror Match too. There's Kaiku that can fit into those decks, fit into the Warrior decks. There's more beatdowny decks that are kind of like the Warrior decks, but a little bit more on the beast side. But honestly, the Warrior decks I think are just the typical beatdown deck. There's a bunch of other fringe decks that people sometimes play. Monarchs can sometimes see a little bit of play. There's so many different decks in GOAT format, it's hard to actually have a collection for the side deck, but we'll use that for right now. I think that's a pretty reasonable representation of what we've been seeing recently. Some zombie decks too. I thought about pulling out a zombie card, but some zombie decks you can sometimes see, Gravekeepers even. What are we side decking? So this might sound like an interesting option, but I actually have 3 copies of Mobius in here, and with a deck that plays Decree, you might think, well, isn't that a little bit of overkill? And I'd actually argue that it's not as much overkill as you might think. When you play a decree-based deck, in games 2 and 3, your opponent is going to be very wary about saving their MSTs and even their breaker effects for decree. And you don't want to be stuck in a situation where you've relied on decree for the early stages of the game and then they get rid of it, and then they still have all those back rows and you have a hard time pushing through it. If you can start picking off these back rows or those back rows with Mobius in the middle of the game, I think you actually find yourself pretty far ahead. I also find that its attack is really hard for warrior decks to deal with. They have ways of dealing with it, obviously, but a lot of those are with traps, and if you have decree plus Mobius and you get that effect early, it puts a lot of pressure on the opponent, and I really like having Monarchs against that particular variant. I also have 2 copies of Gravekeeper Spy just to really boost how well your sets are, right? Cards like Magician of Faith is a little bit of a liability against Warrior. Spy is obviously really difficult for that deck to deal with effectively. And they have their ways. They play that Ninja card for a reason. The Ninja Grandmaster Suzuki, they have ways of dealing with it. Mystic Swordsman level 2. But they have to have those, right? And you have cards like Book of Moon in your deck. You might be able to Book of Moon the Suzuki and then flip your Spy, attack over it, right? There are ways that you can deal with it too. So a couple of copies of Gravekeeper Spy. I also have 1 more Apprentice Magician in order to boost the package if I feel like it's necessary. The other monster that's in here is a Tribe Infecting Virus. Tribe's pretty good against Warriors. That's a interesting card because this is one of the cards that fell out of popularity pretty quickly when Goat format was first sort of reintroduced and people had this sort of renaissance looking at Goat format, and they started to reevaluate cards like Premature, Tribe, Swords of Revealing Light at one point was almost not quite a staple, but a very popular card that's actually starting to see play again against Warrior decks. So Tribe Infecting Virus is a good example of a card that has fluctuated in popularity over the years, but it is good against Warriors and you're playing Thunder Dragon. So we're going to play a single copy of Tribe. I alluded to the fact that I have a couple copies of Creature Swap. I really love Creature Swap. It's a card that's not overwhelmingly popular, but I think it's an interesting card when you have cards like Apprentice Magician in your deck. And then I am playing 3 copies of Scapegoat, so it functions really well there. I don't have Tomatoes or those type of recruiters, but I actually think Apprentice Magician's an insane card to combine with this. And then obviously you have Tsukiyomi too, so there are other ways in which this works. So a couple copies of Creature Swap. We have the MST in case you play against, against like a Panda Burn or even other burn decks. You do want to destroy their back rows, right? Decree doesn't do anything, it's level limit. So you do want to have a card like MST somewhere in the main or side deck. I have a couple copies of Curse Seal for the combo-based decks. I also have a copy of Wabaku, just to hedge a little bit, right? You could put a 3rd copy here, but sometimes Wabakuing against the Reasoning decks is just as good as using Curse Seal. Now, it's not as good against some of the other combo decks, like the Royal Magical Library decks, but it is a little bit of a compensation for the reality that I do want some flexibility to have multiple options and not just have Curse Seal. Then there's a couple of just Mass Destruction Trap cards. If you feel like it's unnecessary for you to keep Decree in games 2 and 3, which would happen in a Decree mirror match, I do like having a couple of just generic power traps to swap into. Your opponent, particularly if the game goes long in game 1 and doesn't see these, they might play around it. And then you can side them in for the Decrees. Again, if your opponent's either playing Decree or you feel like Decree's not that effective against them, right? If they're only playing 4 or 5 traps, 6 traps, maybe you just side the Decrees out, put in Mirror Forces, put in the MST, and now all of a sudden you can catch them by surprise. Maybe they even shave some of the traps in their deck. That happens a lot, right? When you play against Decree, sometimes one of the ways of counteracting it is to actually side out the traps in your deck that are low impact. Maybe they're main decking Sakuratsu Armor, for example. And now all of a sudden you've sided out the Decrees. Now you just play a match where there's not a lot of traps. And you might even surprise them with these instead of Decree set. So that is currently the Goat format deck that I have built and that I brought to the regional this past weekend. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments how you feel about this. This is the first time that I have profiled a retro format acknowledging the reality that this particular format has undergone some pretty significant changes. And I'm really curious to see how you feel about these specific type of profiles. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.